Hello and welcome back to my channel. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have with me Joe Martino, founder of Collective Evolution. Welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sarah. It's good to be here and appreciate the invite.
You're so welcome. It's fabulous to have you here. And Joe, one of the things that I really love about your work is that you really bridge that kind of gap, as it were, between inner transformation and outer world, particularly outer world events. And it's something that I've been noticing within the truth community. I actually had an experience recently. I posted in a sovereignty group, and the founder of the group came back to me and said, "Can you keep it on point, please?" So I was a little bit curious and questioned what on point was. So I said, "I guess it depends on how you define sovereignty." And I said, for me, it's about that freeing ourselves within. It's really about that inner authority rather than, external authority. And the lady said, I totally agree, but I've just noticed within this group that when inner posts are triggering people. So I found that was really, really interesting. And I'm just curious how you're navigating this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good observation. And I think it's telling of something in particular, at least from my perspective. I'll kind of answer by first saying, when we first started way back in 2009, from the standpoint of consciousness, inner transformation, and this look at current events, there was a lot of vitriol towards, consciousness at that point was pseudoscience, right? All these subjects where you can't talk about any of these things. But there was a lot of a deep amount of anger in what was arising in people as they were learning about what was going on in the world. And that's fair. It's okay to go through that. And I think that's totally normal to feel that when your boundaries have been crossed on such a large scale. But over the course of time, there started to be more of a buy-in of, wait a minute, like, how do we know that if we, let's say, as a thought experiment, that if we removed some of the people in positions of power, that whoever showed up next would actually not become corrupt themselves? How do we know that, right? When you start to think about that question and you start to look at history and you start to look at how things degrade in our society and in terms of leadership and how leadership becomes corrupted and the game dynamics that sort of pull everybody into this stuff, you start to realize that most people were once, what we call quote unquote good people. And whether it's through trauma or grooming or different ways in which they're brought into the game, they start playing a game that's not as ideal. And so this idea of inner transformation became more palatable because people realized, well, we have to change as people to be able to hold, in the case of your brand here, a new earth, right? Hold a new idea. And so the inner transformation became a lot more interesting to people. Now, I think what was happening over the course of time, and this isn't to sort of like poke at anybody, but I think there was a lot of, I know the ideas around this, but I may not be practicing it and holding it and really doing it, working on that inner transformation at a deeper level. And so I think people became frustrated with not necessarily feeling as much of that inner peace as they thought they might have gotten over 5, 6, 7 years of playing with it, but at the same time feeling as though the external world was becoming more and more difficult to hold and difficult to be with and difficult to feel resilient in. And so I think what happened was almost a frustration. And this we saw this greatly with COVID. Is you could argue COVID was almost like a time of war. And I think people are still feeling that right now, where there was information warfare, there was spiritual warfare, there was, just what felt like an authoritarian clamp that was, okay, this is it, right? And for a lot of people, I think it was like, there's no time now for inner transformation. This is not what it's about. Right now, we got to solve all the problems. And so I think that became sort of the zeitgeist for a little while, and I think it still is. I do see it coming down now, where people are coming back to the inner transformation side of things, realizing, wait a minute, the world didn't end with COVID. And depending on where I place my attention, I can realize that things aren't as bad as I thought, depending on how bad I thought they were. and and now I just want that peace again. I want to feel that peace because that piece does lead toward better decision making, better critical thinking, better connection with community, better creativity, all that kind of stuff, right? So the way I navigate it, to come all the way back to the beginning part of the question, the way I navigate it is I try to have patience with people and understand where they're at, but I ask them questions like, really, where are you? Like, why do you feel that way? Why do you feel that this is not important? Or why do you feel that this is, and I kind of work it, and I get curious about them, where they're sitting, how they're feeling. I really empathize with their anger, their frustration, to be fair, there's a lot of people in the more new agey type communities that are very, you can't talk about any of the darkness. You can't talk about any of the bad things, right? And that can be frustrating to certain people too. So I think that's enough for now there.
It's a really interesting time, isn't it? And, how can we, the question for me is how can we kind of come to a place where we're able to form a sacred circle? Because for me, that is the place that healing can happen. Because whilst we're in this polarization, in a way, it's the same tactics. That's what's wanted, that kind of divide and conquer. So it's like, how can we be bigger than that? How can we see that, really ultimately there is no out there? I know that sounds a little bit extreme, because obviously there is a collective consciousness, that has its, it's a life of its own, but how our individual consciousness interacts with that. And ultimately, if we create that peace within and allow it to filter out, then how does that then start to change the collective? It's a really interesting conversation. Do you have any thoughts on that, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as, if you walk into a room and you can feel whether that room has tension or whether that room has a sense of lightness, that dynamic is usually created by the total sum of the people there and how they're feeling and what they're holding emotionally. Now, it is true that one person can sort of upset that vibe quite a bit just by being really down and out. But generally, we can see in our own experience of life that how we feel inside emanates outside of us. There's also a pretty good scientific argument to be made based on all the work that the Institute of Heart Math has done, showing the electromagnetic field of the heart, how that is impacting our environment, other people's hearts, other people's brains, other people's nervous systems, thus other people's emotions, right? So, there is that whole piece to the puzzle where we can see that how we feel is ultimately going to affect other people. At the same time, you talked about this idea of a sacred circle and how do we create that space, that healing. And this is where we're sort of butt up against this hard question of engaging in what feels like, deeper inner work that's going to take a period of time, versus what can I do, let's say, as like an activist to really push, because maybe that's more important. And that's what feels like I need to handle right now because, we're in survival mode. Well, you start to realize that that sort of activist approach has been going on forever. We've always been trying to, there's always been this sort of push. And I mean, things arguably keep going in a direction of more authoritarianism, more destruction, more polarization, more. So is that working? And it's not to say that it's not entirely, because it does work, it does have a role in certain regards, but can it be held, can activism be done in a more embodied way? Which is to say, from a place of less survival physiology. So to go right into the scientific part of this, if we wanted to, our nervous system determines the type of thoughts that we have, the way we see the world, so on and so forth. If we are in that sort of angsty survival, the world is coming down around us sort of feeling, not only does our energy emanate that, but our thoughts do, our emotions, our reactions, the way that we talk to people, the tone of our voice, the way we hear other people's voices, the facial expressions we make, right? They all change physiologically based on that survival mode. So if we're in survival a lot, our world is going to appear more dangerous, and we're going to appear more dangerous to each other on a subconscious level. So you could say that deeper regulation in the nervous system, which would be to become what you might say is more the natural state of a human being, is going to have much less survival in the system. And thus you're going to have very different thoughts, very different emotions, a very different vibe or energy. You're not going to be seeing the world as totally hopeless. You're going to see where there is objective difficulty and where there is possibility, and you're going to be able to hold that possibility because there's resilience in the system. So, for me, it comes back to that sacred circle, that sacred space is held by having people focus on how do we get back to this more regulated space within ourselves. And from that, we're going to have better ideas anyway. Our activism is going to be more powerful. We're going to know when to push and when to stop because we're going to be able to see things more clearly. And I think that kind of is how we move towards that.
Yeah, and just to add another piece, when we're in survival mode, we're in fear. And it's likely that the programmings that are going to be running when we're in fear are separation programming.
Yeah.
So when we step outside of that, we can start to come together a lot more. There's more room for collaboration, there's more room for community. And for me, this is how we can really start to make these shifts, because if one person is doing the inner work, that's one thing. But if we all come together and do the inner work, then exponential shifts are possible. So yeah. I know you have a community, Collective Evolution. Did you want to talk a little bit about the kind of work that you do within your community?
Yeah, we have a mixture of things in there. I mean, given that we've been this brand that has tried to focus on looking at and sort of making sense of the external world so that we can kind of make sense of ourselves at the same time. And then also when we make sense of the external world, we can solve problems from a different way of looking at it, right? Where we might not just be playing the same old political games, but seeing how can we really look at changing our system from its core. Because we talk about that, and we also talk about the transformational side, which you could argue is sort of the foundation that helps all of this other stuff work. We have a mixture of stuff that, within that membership that we've had over the years. And I would say at the moment have kind of paused on ongoing live events where we would do practices together, or we would do different workshops and things like that, because it's just been kind of the flow for us over the last little while because of the way our company has changed through the censorship era and the demonetization era. But if, in that community, there's anything from, different practices people can do, different workshops that explore critical thinking, that explore this idea of embodied sense making, that explore this idea of how do we bring on more regulation within the nervous system. And then there's stuff where we might be exploring and making sense of things going on in the world. But to be honest, that platform is, I'm going through a little bit of a change within it, where hopefully within the coming months, what will emerge is more of this sort of wisdom gym type idea that was always sort of the foundation of when we first started it in 2017. That's what we really wanted it to be. But if anybody knows our journey over the last, 7 or 8 years, you'll know why it was hard to fully implement that. But yeah.
Amazing stuff, because your background is as a somatic practitioner, isn't it? So the whole kind of presence and awareness of how you're feeling in any kind of situation is absolutely key, even when approaching external current affairs.
Yeah, I will say that, to be really clear, I started training in that sort of realm of nervous system health, and which comes with somatic stuff. I started training in that in 2020, going through lots of different trainings and courses, and I'm still going in that, expanding my knowledge, working that. But a lot of the ideas came from initially just exposure to the healing arts, ancient practices, and sort of things that have been around for a really long time, whether it be through Taoism or Vedic philosophies, or all these sorts of what we might call spiritual practices and ways of orienting to and looking at the world. So all of that kind of created this focus on embodiment, this focus on meditation, this focus on awareness. And that's what made me realize initially that, hey, the ways in which we best make sense of our world is when we can sort of step aside from and see where our biases are, see where we're getting caught up in certain things, but also see where our emotions might be coloring situations. And so we always advocated for sort of this, like, yeah, come be a little bit more present within yourself, try and create more coherence within the heart, which is going to synchronize the brain. It's going to open up empathy. It's going to open up our critical thinking. We're going to see the world more widely, in a sense. And then that became I would say, even clearer and stronger to me as to what was going on within those practices when I started the nervous system and somatic type training, because then I started to realize, oh, that's why I felt like that would work. This is where it's affecting the physiology. This is where the brain's changing. This is, so that's kind of how the training of the last 5 years has really emboldened those initial practices. And I'm so glad that I started down this route of the nervous system side of things, because it has just been like light bulb after light bulb of actually being able to discern a little bit better too, the difference between like intuition, like types of intuition, being better able to discern like when we are feeling an energy of something, and is it really somebody else's or is it our own? Or am I really sensing a truth in something, or is it something else playing out? And there's so much more clarity there through the nervous system stuff. And so I think it's a fantastic foundation.
It's powerful work. And actually, the last podcast was all about trauma. And recently, I just put on a vagal nerve balancing as well. So do check out those podcasts as well if you haven't seen those, because it's just very, very, very important work, isn't it? That regulation of the nervous system.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on something you said about witnessing and observing.
Yep.
Because that's a really important piece of, in terms of, that inner witnessing, but holding that as we start to meet the world, and how that has then the potential to kind of shift our view. It shifts our inner view of what's possible, because we're actually observing changes within ourselves. We're seeing things in different ways, and then that creates a kind of bigger container within ourselves, and that enables that then to be reflected in our view of the world. So I'm just interested to see if you have anything to share.
Yeah, it's the epitome of an expansion of consciousness. Oftentimes that word is used, or sorry, I should say that statement is used, and it's sort of like, yeah, we got to expand consciousness. We got to expand consciousness. Great. What does that mean? And for us, what it always meant was this idea of exploring where it is that we are creating limitation within our perspective, ourselves, what is possible in our world, and then where we're also seeing the limitation in other people, or going quick to, oh, that person's like this and they're just bad, or they're just evil, or this is just how that works, or that's just how that is. But when you begin to realize that everything we have here is essentially been made up. All right, we've made up everything as a humanity, and ideas get sold enough, and then everybody buys into them, and then we play with them, right? And that's all it is. And when you begin to sense your own interiority and the ways in which that you feel about something, and then you have a greater sense of then being able to sense into somebody else, but then also sense into how somebody is sensing you, and how much interplay there is there, which is, to be honest, this is all built within the human physiology to happen naturally, right? Our natural state is this, to be these connected, very empathetic sort of human beings that can sense each other, and that belong in community together, and that require connection. All these faculties are there, but we've become so individually focused, so mentally focused, that it's hard for us to even imagine that sense of being and that sense of relating to one another. But that sense of relating changes the way we interact, communicate, see connection, interconnection, not only between ourselves and other people, but our environment and nature, and so on and so forth, which then kind of creates an experiential shift in our worldview. And this is where we get the expansion of consciousness. Well, if I feel that way, and I can sense that way, and I feel that person is, changes or is affected by myself, then why would I want to do certain things knowing I'm going to hurt other people? And it just it stops resonating. Certain actions stop resonating, right? And similarly, we begin to have more freedom and permission space within our own consciousness to imagine, well, why did we make up this game that way? Why are things functioning the way they're functioning? Why are we even like buying into some of, let's say, the political or societal ideas we have, which then gives us an opportunity to question, well, what would we want to do instead? And that expansion of consciousness, again, in my opinion, kind of creates that openness to possibility. And that to me is as physiological of a journey as it is mental.
So, sorry, you put the question there now. What would you want to do instead? How would that look for you personally, Joe?
Yeah. So are we saying here with this question, what could the world look like? Let's say we did a whole bunch of shifting and different things. What would it look like?
Yeah, yeah. If you were embodying, if you were fully embodying that new worldview, what
Yeah.
would it look like?
So for me, I mean, I believe this planet and this journey is meant to be co-created. So I believe that within all of us, there are glimpses and different pieces to the puzzle that you can kind of see, but it requires the creativity of so many of us. And therefore, I don't know that any singular person is going to have like the vision of the future per se. However, when I think of the qualities, when I think of the ways, and you might get a glimpse of how something could look, I see a world where we do embrace technology in an incredible way, for example, to produce various forms of automation and stuff for necessities, getting our human needs met in ways that help us to not have to put so much time and energy into doing the basic things so that we then have the energy to continue expanding with the way we think about and want to play, or maybe explore different things or do things that help everybody, right? It's going to take a long time for us to go from where we are now to a world where you might say is more fair or more grounded in a sense of human thrivability, right? It's going to take a long time, and so there's transition, right? But really, it's this idea of how do we get to this space in this world, in the way that we are, and the way that we're feeling, and the way that we're being, that is much more connected to a sense of calmness, to a sense of relaxed, drop shoulders, smiling faces more so, right? Like just this sense of just feeling more like that. That's what I see. That's what I feel is just calm, relaxed human beings that aren't trying to survive that so aggressively. And then imagine how that looks. So, we wouldn't have hunger and thirst and all these particular issues that are all man-made. There's absolutely no reason on this planet other than through our man-made systems for people to be hungry and not have water and not have shelter. So those sorts of things would be shored up. Like I said, technology would be a big part of it. Things like the energy technologies I've seen with my own eyes that can totally move us away from fossil fuels and types of renewables that are outdated, in my opinion, would provide energy to everybody. And with energy, that's how you expand the possibility of a civilization, right? I don't believe we need to cut back. I believe we need to expand in the way that we do things. But there would be a sense of interconnection and interbeingness between us and our environment. So environmental destruction would no longer make sense. Things would slow down. Yeah, innovation would probably slow down a little bit. And what I mean by that is we wouldn't be competing so aggressively and thus destroying everything in the process to win at a game that's going on. So we might take a little bit more time pulling together ideas and innovating. But then again, because we're in a situation where we're not constantly just trying to survive, we're not in a rush to like innovate and innovate. Like we're so used to everything trying to move so fast and everybody rushing and everybody
We can
competing that
enjoy. It's time to
it's
play.
yeah, it seems
Time to
wild for
create.
people to
Yeah.
imagine. Yeah, the creativity, the playfulness, all this sort of stuff. So I think of these qualities, I think of these feelings, and but I don't necessarily see, hey, this is how the entire world is going to look, because I don't think that's anybody's role. I think it's a co-created thing that we got to do here. But there are definitely qualities, there are definitely feelings that arise, and a lot of it has to do with we are used to a baseline of experience in our modern world that is one of survival, and we don't know it. We think it's normal. We think we are, uh, let's say, regulated when we have a little bit of angstiness in us, or when we, just kind of feel like we can't quite calm down at the end of the night. Well, it's just kind of normal. That's just how it is, right? Like that's what it means to be human, right? But if you felt and experienced deep, 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 prolonged levels of being deeply regulated in your body, the calm, the relaxation, the drop of the shoulders, just the no tension in the pelvis, no tension in the gut, no tension in the body. and the clarity of consciousness, the clarity of emotion, the emotional fluidity that comes, being able to sense as your stress systems arise and then slowly come down without having to do anything, right? When
I
you
love it.
feel that, you're like, oh my God, like this is how we're supposed to feel. And you realize that, man, I may have gone my whole life without feeling this, or man, I feel like nobody around me is having this experience, right? And maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But the point is there's an entirely different level of experience that we are not having regularly as humans. And that is making us feel as though a lot of things are not possible, that a lot of things will be incredibly difficult, and
Thank
that
you
we need
so
to
much
fight.
for sharing that. I love it. And I had someone on recently that was a birth expert. And she was talking about, it's how we're coming in with all this stress. If we can come in with oxytocin, then that's wiring our nervous systems differently, so how can we create that so we're in this kind of oxytocin kind of living, as a collective, how can we make that shift? It's a really interesting question. And I'd just like to share something about my own personal journey. We moved to Portugal in 2020 to set ourselves up self-sufficiently here, get a piece of land and everything. A little bit in survival mode, in terms of everything that was going on in the world at the time. And as we've been on this journey, we quickly realized that self-sufficiency is impossible. And actually, listening to what you said, what's come up for me is the shift that I'm navigating at the moment is how can we create something beautiful in our community? How can we come together? So I think that, the piece within that is that, we have lost that community in the world that we're living in. And it's so important, to be able to enjoy, it's bigger than just a family event, it's really important. So a lot of people say that you can only get that in person. And I think that there is something to be said for that. But I also believe it's possible to get that online in finding our tribe, and I think that that's actually really important because we can't necessarily find our family of frequency within our local community. We might at this point, that's probably going to change as more people awaken, but at this point I think that a lot can be gained by finding that online community.
Yeah. I agree. And you said something there about sort of stretching beyond like the family in a sense. And, it reminds me of an example I often bring up to people as a bit of a thought of experiment is, people will say, oh, I would do that for like, say what you're asking. I do that for my brother, but I may not do that for my neighbor. Or I do that for my son, but I may not do that for my neighbor, or the guy down the street. And I said, that's part of the challenge, right? And is that we view our immediate family as somehow more important than others. And not only that, we've created a sense of sort of pride around family first, family first.
Yes.
And I get that the intentions are beautiful, and I get that inherently there is a stronger connection between you and your family, but the quickness that we have in saying, I don't want to help that person because they're not my family, or how fast we push them at a distance is very, very odd to me, because I've not been a person like that. I love helping people. I love doing things like that. And people often look at you like, why the hell are you helping me? You're a stranger. And it's like, that's the world I want to live in, is that, right? And to be clear, because inevitably every time I bring this up, there's always like, well, you got to set your boundaries, and you can't help everybody, and you can't save it. And it's like, you're right. But there's a huge difference between trying to help everybody and only helping you and caring for you and your family, right? And then there's all this space in between that we are not exploring.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree. The savior complex can be a real problem. I'm going to save the world. It can be very much based in ego. But you know what? One of the things moving here to Portugal has really taught me, because we live very rurally, and people have come from all over the world to do the same thing. Portuguese is a really hard language. So it's actually, takes some time to understand how things work here. That the community, the expat community, is really strong, and we do really try and support each other. And it's actually I'm going to say my age now. It's actually my 50th birthday this weekend.
Oh,
And
nice. Happy
what
birthday.
started out as a birthday celebration has now turned into a fundraiser for someone in our community that has cancer. We're going to have a bar with all the donations going, because that's really easy for me to make that shift. I saw it, it's easy to do. And that kind of thing is easy when you're celebrating, you're it's a celebration that's when you're coming together, it's easy then to raise funds and everyone has a great time. So
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
just, it's how can we see these opportunities to support each other in a very natural flowing way.
Yeah.
I think is absolutely key.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a beautiful thing you guys are doing there. And I often like to bring up with people when I think such a great example of sort of this consciousness gone awry of separation and of we shouldn't really care about other people and all these sorts of things is the US medical system is a great example of this. And oftentimes we're fighting over, oh, well, we don't want socialized medicine, you don't want this, you don't want that. And, Americans have very specific ideas around that, and that's fair. They're allowed to. But, when somebody gets sick in your community and they become broke as a result, right? This is just a small example. We need to think holistically, but I'm giving a small example to make a point. And somebody becomes broke as a result of that because your healthcare system bankrupted the company or the family because they got sick.
Yes.
And then now another family and another family and another, and that neighborhood starts to become poor, where now they're in survival mode all the time. And now they can't work. And not only are the kids going to be not raised as well as they could because the attachment and the care and the love is not there, and there's a lot more stress in the household. Not only is the crime going to increase, but the relationships and the way people connect with each other in the neighborhood's all going to decrease, but also all the issues are going to increase. And so something as simple as, oh, well, if government shouldn't take care of anybody and this, that, whatever. And the consciousness that's behind that is built in this idea of separation. We shouldn't take care of each other. Thinking that, well, I'm not the one who's sick, so why should I have to, take care of somebody else? And then you're watching all these people get sick, but it's actually affecting you. It's affecting your property value. It's affecting your life. It's affecting your community. It's affecting crime rates that you're part of. And then maybe you have to leave. And the point here is that all of these things that happen to other people in our community affect us in ways that are not, from point A to point B per se, but they're like A to maybe C and D and E, and, they're a little bit more complicated. Yet people don't think that way because they think so linearly and simple and in a political framework that says, here's how I'm supposed to think, right? The free thinkers oftentimes are actually a lot more closed off in their thinking than they realize because they're bought into a different ideology. And now this isn't all to say, okay, hey, well, we should all have socialized medicine and the government should take care of anybody. It's simply a thought experiment to showcase how something as simple as we don't care about anybody else around us per se actually affects us in a very big way. And it may not be today and it may not be tomorrow, but it could be a few days down the road, right? And then we'll complain about it as if it's somebody else's problem. And until we can create a culture of complexity and thinking and seeing that and sensing that, we're always going to be stuck in this short-term linear thinking that's going to be problematic to how we solve problems.
It's a really interesting one, because a lot of my audience will be light workers, and I think the tendency for light workers is almost the opposite, to overgive and to not charge, So, I mean, I just do want to mention how important self-care and boundary setting that you mentioned earlier really is. But I think what we're really talking about here is finding new ways to look at things and reframe. That doesn't necessarily mean crossing our own boundaries. I'm currently in that journey myself, because I now have a podcast. I'm doing a lot. I'm an ambassador for the People's Health Alliance, so I'm doing a lot of kind of giving work. So how do I leverage my time so it can be more impactful in terms of looking after my own family? So I'm actually making the journey that you're making in terms of setting up a community. I've been running groups for a while, so it's affordable for people, but it still honors my time. And now I'm wanting to also set up a community, a membership community, because it's a way that you can reach more people whilst honoring, your own family's needs. So, I feel that there's ways that we can all, no matter what work we're doing within our own situation, it's about, it's about that, coming back to that sensing that you were talking about earlier, and what feels right for me, what is honoring myself, but at the same time able to really give and feels good ultimately. So
Yeah, I tend to feel, so I echo everything you're saying because I think it's important nuance. And I tend to feel that a lot of the ways that we show up to something is an emergent quality of our internal state. So it goes back to, how exactly would it look, or in what situation might I do this versus that, and whatever. That's the mind trying to figure out something that hasn't happened yet, and then what is the best way to go about it. And not to pick on the guy, but this is kind of the Jordan Peterson-esque feel. When I listen to him, I often feel like he's creating a mental framework for how to live and how to be an archetype in life and what to do. And that's okay. But there's a whole other system and ways of knowing, ways of being, and ways of acting that come from something that isn't a mental construct. And so there's a sense of trust that has to be developed within ourselves and within our own being that allows us to know, okay, when I show up in this situation, yeah, I didn't know that that's how I would have wanted to go beyond and help that person in that moment. I wouldn't have told you I would have done that, but when I showed up and I
yeah,
sensed and I was open enough, yeah, it came out. And so what are the conditions that allow for
yeah,
that type of being to
yeah.
emerge? It's that inner work that we were talking about. It's practicing listening to ourselves more.
And that's very different to, for example, going back to my example earlier of doing a fundraising event, for example, to be a good Christian, or because someone's told you that that's a good thing to do, or because that's
Yeah.
coming from a very different place, from this inner sensing of, this has moved me and this feels like something, that I wish to hold, so it's
Yes.
and it's interesting. And what I find is really interesting is that when we start to engage with life in this way, the universe starts to talk back to us. Do
Mhm.
you find that, Joe?
Absolutely. You get what is often referred to as synchronicity, right? Experiences where you can't explain exactly, oh, this led to that and that, but you're like sort of dumbfounded by it. And that's the mystery and the magic of life that is kind of fun, right? And there tends to be more synchronicity the more we are sensed into this space versus when we are survival, just go, go, go. The world doesn't feel all that magical, right? But
Yes.
this is interesting because you brought up something about sort of, sensing into whether it's a programming of I was taught this is how I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do, or in sensing into that versus there's this emergent desire to reach out to this human and I want to help. And remember I said in the earlier stages of our talk here, the sort of the discerning of what we might call intuition. And intuition is a fascinating thing because I feel like it is one of the most misunderstood things that's out there, only because oftentimes people want, well, I want to listen to my intuition. I want to listen to my intuition, what my guidance is saying, which is great. The challenge is how do we know if it's sort of our conditioning and survival responses playing out, or if it's, let's say, something coming from a really healthy emergent place within ourselves, or even if it's explicit, meaning it's coming from outside of our body, outside of our conditioning, but it's actually some
Yes.
other thing or entity or
Like a
pocket of consciousness.
co-creation. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So there's these different ways of sensing and again, how do you discern? You start to realize when my stress physiology is talking or when
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
regulated physiology is talking. And this takes time. I sometimes will have clients that'll be like, I need to be able to make decisions based on intuition. It's like that's beautiful. I want you to be able to do that. But I'll be honest, like with your journey and where you're at right now, that's gonna be hard because you're trying to listen through layers and layers and layers of trauma and stress and all these, and that's going to be really challenging, not just for you, but for everybody else in
Yeah.
that same
Yeah.
position. And so maybe let's just experiment with making certain decisions and then see, how did that go? How did that feel? And just be okay with making a, a little mistake, or that maybe I didn't make the best decision, but I can still change it, right? And of course, within that, we're talking about certain decisions, not massive life-changing things that might throw you off, kilter entirely. But I think the
Sure.
point is there.
Well, and ultimately, that's how the life has been lived, and that's how we've all lived our lives. Previously when we're in our conditioning, and it's something that I bring up a lot. In terms of, how do we really know if we're stepping outside of that? The example I always use is can we ever really have control? Because if we have control, how could we ever lose it? So there's always this conversation of, whilst we're in the programming, we have no control, but when we step outside of that, then we start to have some free will. But I'm sitting on the fence. I still haven't, I don't pretend to have all the answers. I'm
Mhm.
still not sure that we have any control. I believe that there are greater forces that are working through us as
Mhm.
we start to clear our conditioning. I don't necessarily feel that that's ever our free will, but
Mhm.
we like to think that it's our free will.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it depends on how we define free will and these sorts of
Right.
things too. Um, yeah, I tend to have a slightly, at least from what I think I'm understanding, a slightly different perspective where I feel the same as what you're saying, where we have less free will when there's a lot of conditioning and a lot of trauma, because that stuff sort of becomes our destiny, because we're acting through it in ways that we may not realize. However, I believe there was free will in um, let's say, choosing to stay in our conditioning, even when we begin to know that it's something that's going on and maybe it's not the most favorable behavior. If we're not seeking help, we're kind of we're kind of using our free will to make that choice to some extent. And of course, it could be hard to ask for help and work through this stuff, right? But I agree that or what you were saying, when we start to expand our consciousness and remove some of the programming and kind of get back to this place of what you could say is a more natural emergent human, um, I actually think we do develop a sense of free will that's less based on the programming. Now, do I think that there's sort of these larger external factors like a collective consciousness or an evolutionary journey of the collective that is still sort of holding a journey to some extent? I would say that's kind of where I feel is there's like a big playground that is tending towards an evolutionary journey, but there's a lot of freedom within the bounds of that for free will to play. But there are things that will push and nudge us to want to push towards evolution. Um, it's a whole long conversation, but
It's a
yeah.
fascinating. We could talk for hours on this. I mean, I love the idea of returning to source and peeling away the layers so that we become more of who we truly are, and we connect more with that source within us. And then ultimately, there's that conversation that starts to happen where there's a co-creation. So I guess if I was going to look at it, I'd look at it more in that way rather than the free will,
Mhm.
more as that dialogue, which, what is inside, what is outside, we never really know, because it's all kind of interconnects at that point, the yin and the yang. So
Yeah.
it's a fascinating conversation, and I don't really know where to go with it now, because you could just kind of go in and into that in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a to sort of understand the underpinnings of, let's say, the universe is a difficult question, and it's fun. It's
Yes.
fun to explore and it's fun to play with it. And I feel like in certain altered states of consciousness, you can also get these little bits and details and frameworks for what's going on. But day to day, I find that at the end of the day, it comes down to really just embodying and being what I will say is something that is so accessible, which is finding that that state of sort of what you might call regulated physiology. When we work and we practice and we move towards that and we do the work necessary to come back to that regulated physiology, how we want to live life, the choices, the this, the that, how life opens up, how things change. Like when people talk about consciousness creating reality, that's more to me what is going on is we are creating our reality based on how much our belief about life and things like that shape the way we see the world, which then is how we make our choices. We make our choices based on how we're seeing things.
Yeah.
The opportunities we pay attention to is based on how we're seeing things and whatever, as opposed to I am this individual who has full agency over everything that's happening in my environment, and I can create it
Yes.
with my consciousness, and I can be the CEO because I'm creating it with my consciousness. And it doesn't matter that there's 9 other people all trying to be the CEO and using their consciousness to do it. I don't think that's how it works, but that's how it gets sold, right? It's really easy to sell the consciousness idea in books and in courses like that. But I think it's something different. I think it's more of a co-created journey. I think our
Yes.
souls, or you could say a higher self, a deeper sense of ourselves, we're usually not that concerned about ultra wealth and, being the coolest person on the block or anything like that. There's something much deeper. And I think when we attune to that, the way we see the world also changes.
Thank you so much, Joe, for all the wisdom that you've brought to today. I've really loved chatting with you. I know one of the things when we were talking before that you mentioned you wanted to bring through were really practical things for people to go home with, viewers to hear. Is there anything practical, any last thoughts before we finish up today?
Yeah, I would say do whatever you can in this massively fast-paced world to slow down.
Yeah.
And if that means less social media, if that means taking 5 minutes in between each task just to orient to your environment, to feel your butt in the chair, to just notice and like really make this a practice. Don't hear what I'm saying and then do it once and then forget it, but like really make orienting to your present environment a practice and slowing down and spending 5 minutes multiple times throughout the day. Just what is going on in my environment? What is going on in my interiority? And is my body feeling? And just doing that. And if you make that a practice and sit outside sometimes and do it, you will see some really interesting things begin to change over the course of time, and all the important stressful things that were just busying your mind will slowly begin to turn down, and suddenly you have all this energy, right? And I'm not saying that this little practice is going to change your entire life forever. It's more that it begins to show a glimpse of what it means to come back to this more embodied place, right? And it would probably lead towards doing more of this kind of work, maybe seeing a practitioner that can help with this kind of stuff towards more nervous system regulation. But anything that you can look at, really discern and find some good stuff, some good teachers. I'll mention I've learned a lot from Irene Lyon when it comes to the nervous system space. I'm producing some of my own content at this point that's going to come out soon, but it's not ready. And Irene's a great resource, so check her out. And that to me is like some great places to start that are simple. Don't need to have a crazy morning routine. Don't need to have crazy meditation. Those are all great. But I'm saying it can start this simple, and there are some pretty interesting results that come.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on today, Joe. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah, for having me on. And it was a great conversation, and I enjoyed the direction.
And thank you for everybody to listening. And do hit the subscribe so you can have more New Earth podcasts. Bye for now, everyone.